In this episode, we're going to talk about holding and why aircraft might need to hold. We'll also talk about what pilots do when instructed to go into holding, and we'll talk about the procedures and phraseology you'll be using in class. So let's start out by defining what holding is. The Pilot Controller Glossary defines hold procedure as a predetermined maneuver which keeps aircraft within a specified airspace while awaiting further clearance from air traffic control. Holding is simply a way to keep an aircraft that's already airborne in one location. Aircraft might have to hold for a number of reasons, but some of the more common ones include airport delays or closures due to bad weather, airspace congestion, or for spacing and non-radar operations. Some pilots may request holding for training purposes. Another reason is the one you'll encounter in your radar classes. Academy Approach has 4 uncontrolled airports. If an aircraft at one of those airports, such as Bartles, has been released for departure, the airport is effectively closed until the departure takes off. So if you have an arrival show up that will land at Bartles, you'll have to wait for the departure to take off before clearing the arrival into the airport. You could vector the arrival around until the departure takes off, but it's easier on you and more efficient for the pilot to just put them in holding near the airport. It's easier for you because once an aircraft is instructed to hold, the pilot will enter the holding pattern and circle on their own. It's more efficient for the pilot because it keeps them closer to their destination, reduces fuel burn, and in some cases keeps them in position for an instrument approach once a clearance is issued. Where exactly do aircraft hold? Well, they can hold almost anywhere. Typically an aircraft will hold over a nav aid such as a VOR or NDB. They can also hold over GPS or DME fixes, marker beacons on ILS approaches, or on a radial from a VOR at a specified DME distance. They can even hold over a visual reference point on the ground, though this will usually not be done for IFR aircraft. There are 2 kinds of holding patterns, published and non-published. Published holds are depicted on charts such as IFR en route charts and approach plates and show the holding fix and direction of turns. They might also be accompanied by information such as speed restrictions and the inbound and outbound courses to the nav aid. Non-published holding works the same way as published holding, but since the information isn't printed on a chart, it has to be given to the pilot. We're going to focus on published holding for the purposes of this episode. An aircraft in holding will fly what's basically an oval pattern, but the only part of the pattern that's actually timed is the inbound leg to the nav aid. The turns and the outbound leg will depend on the wind speed and direction at that altitude, and are flown such that the inbound leg to the nav aid will be the correct distance or time. So in reality, the pattern probably won't look exactly like an oval because the pilot will be compensating for wind during the turns and the outbound leg. Turns can be either to the left or right, but most holding patterns will have right-hand turns and are called standard holding patterns. You should also note an important difference in terminology. When talking about holding, you'll hear about direction of turns and the direction of the hold. These are 2 different concepts. Direction of turns refers to the direction the aircraft will turn while in the holding pattern, either left or right. Direction of the hold refers to the direction of the holding pattern relative to the holding fix. For example, northeast, south, southwest, and so on. UND flight instructor Neil Acom joins me now to talk about a pilot's perspective on holding. Neil?
Hi, I'm Neil Acom, flight instructor at the University of North Dakota. And today we're going to be talking about holding patterns and how those relate to the air traffic control environment. A few topics we're going to be talking about today include things I need to do as a pilot to comply with that holding pattern instruction from air traffic control. Holding patterns are an important part to our air traffic control system. Not only does it allow ATC to provide proper separation or spacing, but even can provide a delay for pilots as a way for them to prepare for an approach if they're behind. There's really 2 kinds of basic holding patterns. We have the standard holding pattern here, which is depicted, and the non-standard. Standard holding pattern provides us with right-hand turns. Non-standard is simply left-hand turns. Same kind of pattern, just different direction. After that, we can then look at, well, what kind of pattern is this and where is it located? When looking at the basic holding pattern, a pilot then has their fix. The fix can be either a VOR, an NDB, an intersection, or even a point upon an approach plate. When a pilot looks at this hold, we break it down into simple things. We have an inbound leg and an outbound leg. We have the fixed end, and we have the outbound end. When a pilot looks at these things, they think to themselves, pretty simple. But it becomes a little bit more complex than just that. The standard holding pattern at 14,000 feet and below is a 1-minute leg. above 14,000 feet MSL, the holding pattern then becomes a 1.5 minute leg in timing. The challenge is here, the inbound leg must be this minute or 1.5 minutes, depending upon aircraft altitude, along with other factors we have to think about. As a pilot, whenever I'm flying a holding pattern, I'm really thinking a lot about winds aloft. Winds aloft play a huge factor into how my holding pattern is going to look. Like we said earlier, our inbound leg is either going to be 1 minute below 14,000 feet MSL or 1.5 minutes above 14,000 feet MSL on a standard holding pattern. So as a pilot, we have to factor in here, what's the wind really going to do to my airplane? Well, when I fly inbound, I want that inbound time to be 1 minute. When I make my turn here and I'm going to beam my fix, I then want that outbound leg to be however long necessary to then fly inbound that exact 1 minute. That time can change, maybe plus or minus 10 seconds, maybe 30 seconds. It really depends upon the winds aloft. Do I have a headwind or a tailwind? Headwind or a tailwind will determine what kind of compensation I need to create into my holding pattern timing on the outbound leg to determine the proper inbound time. This is the ideal, but this really honestly never happens in real life. The holding pattern shape generally looks something more like some kind of oblong pear shape. That oblong pear shape is the pilot correcting for wind because we're always making a standard rate turn. So we're trying to correct the aircraft, its ground track, so that we have a nice standard rate turn to our inbound leg. We don't want to overshoot the turn. We don't want to undershoot the turn. Also think about our inbound leg we talked about before, that timing. Timing's never perfect the first time, and most pilots kind of think about the first turn and holding as the gimme hold because they're trying to figure out what the wind's really doing to their holding pattern. Is it, making my inbound leg shorter than what I want it to be? Is it making my inbound leg longer than what I want it to be? So usually the first turn in the holding pattern is fairly close, but not always perfect. So we're always trying to perfect that. So generally the second, and hopefully by the third, we have it down pat. Now we're going to look at what the aircraft actually looks like, maybe in a holding pattern with some winds aloft factored in. The winds aloft here, if you look at the diagram, is pushing the aircraft down here towards the southwest as the winds are out of the northwest. If you look at the aircraft's ground track on the inbound leg, the aircraft is crabbing into the wind in an attempt to maintain that ground track and its course to the VOR in this case. The aircraft then executes its standard rate right turn in our normal holding pattern all the way around to the outbound leg, where they'll again have to crab into the wind. If you look here, the radius of this turn is different, and that's because the wind aloft is pushing the aircraft away from our fix and our holding pattern. As this aircraft flies, they're going to continue keeping their crab all the way in. And you notice that the radius of this turn here is smaller, and the reason is because the winds aloft again are slowing down our ground speed here, thus making the radius of this turn tighter. As you come back around inbound, the pilot will then have to crab back into the wind again to compensate for the winds aloft. Now we're going to talk about how a pilot enters a holding pattern. There are three basic ways we enter our holding patterns. One is the direct entry, next is the teardrop, then we have the parallel entry. Air traffic control has to understand that a pilot may have to make a turn prior to entering their holding pattern. This will occur on the teardrop or the parallel entry. The pilot will then come around and enter their holding pattern after making this turn. Now we're going to talk about published and non-published holding patterns. If it's a non-published holding pattern, ATC must give me where the hold is, the direction of the hold, the type of holding pattern, and the time. If it's a published holding pattern, I'll simply read off the information from the chart. Now that's a pilot's perspective of a holding pattern. Now back to you, Dan.
Coming up next, we'll look at the procedures and phraseology you'll be using in class when holding aircraft. Which of the following would be valid holding points for aircraft in Academy Approaches airspace? A. James NDB, B. Tulsa Vortac, C. Lazy J NDB, or D. All of the above? The answer is D. Any one of these fixes or any published fix or nav aid in Academy Approach's airspace would be valid. Which type of holding pattern entry will require the pilot to make a turn before entering the holding pattern? A. Teardrop, B. Direct, C. Parallel, or D. Both A and C? The answer is D. Both the teardrop and parallel entries require the pilot to make a turn before getting established on an inbound course to the holding fix. Now let's go over the procedures and phraseology you'll need to know. We'll set up a scenario similar to what you'll see in class. You've just issued a clearance to November 54314, which will be departing from James Airport here. A few minutes later, November 441 Papa Juliet checks in here and is heading to James. Since you've released November 54314 from James, you'll have to put November 441 Papa Juliet into holding. Where should we hold this aircraft? If you look at page 6-21 of your UND Air Traffic Control Training Guide, you'll see a map showing all the published holding patterns in Academy Approach's airspace. Holding this aircraft over the James NDB here seems like it would be the most efficient, so that's what we'll do. The first question you should ask yourself is, what altitude did I issue to the aircraft that'll be departing from James? Whatever that altitude is, the altitude you issued to November 441 Papa Juliet should be at least 1,000 feet higher so that separation is assured. Let's assume we issued the departing aircraft 3,000, so we'll use 4,000 for the arrival until November 441 Papa Juliet, descend and maintain 4,000. As you can see on the map, the holding pattern is over the James NDB, which is actually not located at the airport itself. It's to the northwest, here. But there's still a pretty good chance that the departing aircraft could conflict with November 441 Papa Juliet, so by establishing altitude separation, we ensure that there won't be a problem. Now, how do we put November 441 Papa Juliet into holding? The 7110.65 tells us in Chapter 4, Section 6, Paragraph 1. It says, consider operational factors such as length of delay, holding airspace limitations, navigational aids, altitude, meteorological conditions when necessary to clear an aircraft to a fix other than its destination airport. What is the length of the delay? This will be from the present time until the clearance void time you issued to November 54314 when it received its IFR clearance, which we'll say was 0820. Note this time because you'll need it in a minute. Holding airspace limitations aren't an issue here. The navigational aid will be the James NDB, and we've already chosen an altitude to avoid traffic conflicts. As for meteorological conditions, these won't be a factor in your classes. Next, we get the information to include in the holding instructions. Issue the following: A. Clearance limit, B. Holding instructions, C. EFC. The clearance limit will be the holding fix, in this case the James NDB. Under holding instructions, the 7110 says the following: when the pattern is charted, you may omit all holding instructions except the charted holding direction and the statement as published. Always issue complete holding instructions when the pilot requests them. This pattern is published, so all you'll have to say is the direction of the hold and as published. The last item, EFC, stands for expect further clearance. This is simply the time when the pilot can expect to be taken out of holding. Remember the clearance void time you issued to November 54314? The EFC time can be either that time or a few minutes after. The time is read as 4 digits, and let's say it will be 0825. Putting the pieces together, we see that the phraseology formula is aircraft ID, cleared to, and the name of the fix, hold, and then the direction of the fix, as published. Expect further clearance, and then state the time. Now let's plug in our information. Your instruction to November 441 Papa Juliet would be, November 1 Papa Juliet, cleared to James radio beacon, hold northwest as published. Expect further clearance 0825. November 441 Papa Juliet will proceed directly to the James NDB and enter holding, and then await further instructions. Once November 54314 takes off, you can clear November 441 Papa Juliet for its approach. Make sure you know what the aircraft will do once issued the approach clearance so that you don't vector your departure into the arriving aircraft. Approach plates start on page 3-2 of your ATC training guide, so become familiar with them. See episode 6 of ATCast for more on instrument approaches to Academy satellite airports. That's how you'll use holding in class. The process shown in this episode is the same for any of the uncontrolled airports. You'll just plug different airport and fix names into the phraseology. Be sure to check page 6-21 of your Air Traffic Control Training Guide for a map of the published holding patterns in Academy Approaches airspace. Coming up next, we'll review the key points from this episode. The clearance limit in your holding instructions is A, the holding fix, B, the destination airport, C, the final approach fix, D, the nearest fix. The answer is A, the holding fix. If a holding pattern is published, you do not need to issue the A, fix, B, direction of hold, C, radial, airway, or course, or D, any of the above. The answer is C. The only things you have to issue for a published hold are the name of the fix and the direction of the hold. Now for a quick review. Holding is a way to keep an aircraft in one place until air traffic control can provide further clearance. Some reasons aircraft might hold include bad weather, airport delays, or airspace congestion. You'll hold aircraft in class when working with uncontrolled departures and arrivals. When an aircraft is released for departure at an uncontrolled airport, no other IFR aircraft can land there until the departure takes off. So if an arrival for that airport shows up, you'll have to put them into holding. Aircraft can hold over any navigator fix, and holding patterns can be either published or non-published. Published means the pattern is printed on charts that the pilot can reference. Non-published holds can be used, but more detailed instructions would have to be given to the pilot. See page 6-21 of your ATC training guide for a map of published holding patterns in your airspace. The actual shape of the holding pattern is determined by wind speed and direction, and pilots may need to make a turn once reaching the fix in order to enter the hold depending on the location of the aircraft relative to the holding fix. Make sure you don't issue the same altitude to the departure and the aircraft that will be holding over or near the airport. You should also become familiar with the approach plates found in your ATC training guide so that you will know what to expect when aircraft are issued an approach clearance to your uncontrolled airports. When issuing the clearance, you have to include the clearance limit, holding instructions, and EFC. The phraseology for a published hold is aircraft ID, cleared to the name of the fix, hold, and then the direction of the fix as published. Expect further clearance and then the time. In our example, it was November 1 Papa Juliet, cleared to James radio beacon, hold northwest as published. Expect further clearance 0825.